Tab 1 on the night of March 2, 2006, a 28-year-old police corporal named Sergio Poeta was patrolling a remote dirt road in rural Argentina on his motorcycle. It was pitch black out with no streetlights whatsoever. On either side of the road were mostly vast, open fields, occasionally interspersed with thick patches of forest and dense vegetation with the massive mountains rising up silently in the background. There was absolutely nobody around him for miles. This was a remote area called the Poma, which was incredibly famous for its beautiful natural landscapes and traditional cowboy culture. Sergio was out here patrolling for poachers who came out at night to trap or kill the wild cats, monkeys, and exotic birds that often sold for a lot of money on the black market. It had been an exceptionally quiet night so far, but Sergio knew from experience that the later it got, the more likely it would be that he would catch someone doing something highly illegal. At around 10 o'clock in the evening, Sergio was riding down the road towards the crossroads that locals called El Cruz de las Cañas. Up ahead, in the deep darkness, he saw the red tail lights of a car. At first, it seemed like this car was coming to a stop, but then it turned off the road and drove into a nearby cluster of low trees and thick vegetation about the size of a football field. Then, these tail lights disappeared. Sergio felt his heart start to beat a bit faster because he knew this had to be a poacher. He thought this poacher had seen him and realized he could be a cop, and so was driving off the road and basically trying to hide. Sergio sped up on his motorcycle, and when he reached the spot where this car had left the road, he pulled over and parked. Sergio climbed off his bike and then radioed into headquarters his location and asked for backup. Then he unholstered his gun. He knew this far out it was going to take backup a long time to get here, and Sergio had no intentions of letting these poachers get away. Sergio had a flashlight, but he did not bother to take it out because he did not want to give away his position to whoever was hiding. But in the darkness, Sergio was having a really hard time finding where in this thick vegetation the car had actually gone. There were no broken branches or crushed bushes. The entire vegetation looked completely uniform and intact, and so Sergio, with his gun drawn in front of him, began pacing along the shoulder of this dirt road, looking for tire tracks on the ground. But after looking for a while, he could not find any. There was no indication that a car was ever here or drove into this vegetation, and so eventually Sergio just stopped and listened. He figured the poachers could only have driven a little ways into the trees before stopping, and so he hoped to hear them moving around. But as he stood there, all he could hear was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the crickets and cicadas chirping and buzzing, the hoots of owls, and the long, strange calling sound of birds known as nightjars. Sergio knew if he wanted to catch these poachers, he could not just sit here all night hoping they made a noise. He took a deep breath, stepped off the road, and made his way into the trees. He walked quickly but carefully, moving branches aside with one hand and holding his gun with the other, constantly scanning left and right for any movement or light. And when he was about 100 feet into the trees, he finally saw something out of the corner of his eye. He caught a glint in the darkness, and for a second, it almost looked like moonlight reflecting off of something metal. And so Sergio thought that had to be the car and that he had caught them. But when Sergio turned to face them, he immediately realized there was no car. What he saw was so jarring and terrifying that for a second he just stood there, frozen to the spot. And as he did, the sounds in the forest began to amplify all around him, and he felt this panic building inside of his chest. He wanted to scream, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came out. A few minutes later, an off-duty police officer who was friendly with Sergio was heading to bed in his home when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw it was Sergio calling him. So he opened his phone and said hello, but Sergio did not say hello back to him. Instead, in a voice that was unusually cold and monotone, Sergio just said, "Come to Las Canas, you know what to do." And before this other officer could ask Sergio what he meant, the line just went dead. The officer tried to call Sergio back, but Sergio did not answer. The officer really had no idea what was going on here. This was exceptionally odd behavior by Sergio, and so this officer felt compelled to call it into headquarters just in case. The off-duty police officer stared at his phone in disbelief. He tried calling Sergio back 4 or 5 times, but each time it went straight to a busy signal or just kept ringing. The cold, monotone voice lingered in his head, sounding almost like Sergio was speaking under hypnosis or being forced to read a script. It was a voice stripped of all emotion, which was terrifying because Sergio was normally a very lively and expressive person. Knowing that Sergio was patrolling alone in one of the most remote and desolate sectors of the district, the officer knew he could not just ignore this. He got out of bed, threw on his uniform, and decided to call the station. When he explained the situation to the dispatcher's voice tensed up. The dispatcher explained that they had already lost contact with Sergio's radio. In a small, tight-knit department, a lost officer is everyone's worst nightmare. The dispatcher had already sent 3 patrol units to the coordinates Sergio had given during his initial call. The off-duty officer decided he could not sit at home, so he got into his personal vehicle and started driving towards Las Cañas himself, praying that his friend was just having radio trouble and nothing more. But when this officer got the dispatcher on the phone, the dispatcher told him they actually already had backup on their way to Sergio right now. And the dispatcher told him that they were actually pretty worried about Sergio too, because after Sergio's first radio call had come in where he gave his location and asked for backup, they had lost contact with him entirely. Every time they had tried to call him back, he was not answering. Meanwhile, the backup, which consisted of 3 police cars full of heavily armed officers, sped past vast cornfields into the remote area that contained Las Cañas where Sergio had last been. And when they got to the actual spot on the road where Sergio had said he was, they found his motorcycle parked neatly, but Sergio was nowhere to be found, and nobody else was there either. It was just this lone motorcycle. And so the 3 cars pulled over near the motorcycle and the officers got out. One of the officers tried again to hail Sergio on the radio, but again they were met with absolute silence. And so they all fanned out with their flashlights and began searching this road up and down looking for any sign of Sergio in the dark. And after a minute or two, one of the officers spotted this cluster of metal in the sand by the side of the road. Now, this officer did not immediately connect whatever this metal was with whatever happened to Sergio. They just walked over to see what it was. But when he actually reached it and shone his light directly on it, he gasped and called out to the other officers, telling them to come over. Because these pieces of metal definitely had something to do with Sergio. They were the completely disassembled parts of Sergio's radio and his gun. The pieces were lying in a neat pile in the sand, with the small screws and internal components laid out meticulously, which made no logical sense. This discovery immediately launched a major police search operation. More backup poured into Las Cañas, and officers teamed up and continued to search the dark area. And pretty quickly, officers found what looked like Sergio's footprints heading away from the road and into the cluster of trees. So the officers began to follow them. However, after getting about 100 feet into the trees following these footsteps, they noticed something very strange. The footprints were getting further and further apart. At first, the officers thought that maybe Sergio began sprinting and taking really big, long strides. But as they continued following these steps through the trees and out the backside into this big field, the distance between these steps continued to get bigger and bigger. Soon, the distance between each footprint was 10 feet, then 15 feet, and then 20 feet. Even if Sergio had been sprinting at full speed and literally leaping, this was too big of a distance for any person to cover. This was literally humanly impossible. The police officers following these prints looked at each other uneasily. Each footprint was perfectly clear in the soft ground, and there was no mistaking this was Sergio's boot. And then also, they were certain they were not missing prints in between the ones they could see. They really were spaced this far apart, as if he was being carried or thrown. The officers had been talking to each other when they began following these prints, but now they just walked in absolute silence, overwhelmed by the eerie nature of the trail. For more than a mile, they tracked Sergio's bizarre, seemingly impossible trail through open fields and clusters of trees until they arrived at a large cornfield. And then suddenly, the trail of footprints just stopped. The last clear mark was a deep imprint of his right boot, and then nothing. It was like Sergio had pushed off his right foot and then just vanished into the air. The search for Sergio went on all night, despite the fact that it started to pour rain at around 2 o'clock in the morning, making the search conditions miserable. The officers never gave up, shining their flashlights through the mud and rain. However, beyond those footsteps, they never found any other trace of Sergio. And there was one other thing police could not find. There was absolutely no sign of the poachers that Sergio had called in before he had vanished. There were no tire tracks from any vehicle other than Sergio's motorcycle. There was no broken vegetation or anything like that. It looked like no car had ever been driven into these trees. And there were no signs of any kind of struggle either that would explain why Sergio was gone and why his gun and radio were disassembled by the side of the road. The whole situation just made absolutely no sense. At 4:30 in the afternoon on March 3rd, 2006, so roughly 18 hours after Sergio had disappeared, a farmer was walking on his property about 12 miles away from Las Cañas when he looked up ahead and saw this dark figure sitting by the side of the road. The farmer squinted to get a better look, and the figure looked like a man, but he was all curled up into a ball and he was sitting directly in the mud. Now, keep in mind this area is deep in the middle of nowhere, and so this farmer did not get a lot of people passing through his land. And so to see anybody out here was pretty rare, let alone what he was seeing now. And so feeling curious, the farmer called out to this man but did not get any response. And so he just started walking towards him. And when he got up close, he saw this man was a police officer in full uniform. He had his knees pulled up to his chest with his arms wrapped tightly around them, and his head was buried in his lap, and so the farmer could not see his face. And weirdly, even though it had only recently stopped raining and the ground that the officer was sitting on was still wet and muddy, this man and his uniform were totally dry, with no mud or water on his clothes. The farmer leaned down and gently put his hand on the man's shoulder and asked if he was okay. But the officer did not react at all. He just stayed there motionless, head in his lap, not reacting, totally silent. And this was just too strange. The farmer backed away, took out his phone, and he called the police. It did not take long for the police to show up and identify this seated police officer as Sergio Poeta. But Sergio would not talk to the police any more than he would speak to the farmer. He did not appear to be physically injured, but there was definitely something wrong with his mental state. So the officers called an ambulance and they summoned Sergio's boss, the police chief, to see if he could get Sergio to respond in any way. And when Sergio's boss showed up, he was able to coax Sergio up off the wet ground, but still Sergio would not speak a single word. All he would do is give his boss a big hug and just break down and cry. So his boss led Sergio over to the ambulance, which had just arrived, and he got him in the back and he sat with him, and then he went with Sergio to the hospital and followed him into his exam room. At first, inside the exam room, Sergio did not want anybody to touch him and he was very anxious and paranoid. He kept squinting and grimacing every time the lights were put on him as if they were causing him physical pain. But after a few minutes, he did let the doctors and nurses remove his clothes and examine his body for wounds. Sergio's boss had expected that Sergio would have severe injuries. He figured he had likely been assaulted, beaten, or kidnapped by aggressive poachers. But as he watched the doctors and nurses check Sergio out, it was very clear that Sergio did not have any external injuries. There were no bruises, no cuts, and no sign of any physical struggle at all. And not only that, as the nurse took Sergio's vitals, it was clear that he was not dehydrated or sick at all, despite the fact he had just been missing for 18 hours with no food or water supplies. The only injury the medical team did find on Sergio was to his feet, but it did not help clarify anything. When they removed Sergio's boots and socks, they found these bizarre, deep burns on the soles of his feet. It looked like he had been standing directly on an incredibly hot surface. Over the next couple of hours, Sergio did finally begin to talk, and here is the totally wild story that he told the investigators. At 10 o'clock the night before, when Sergio had followed the poachers into the trees, he had been absolutely certain that he had seen the metal of the poacher's car reflecting the moonlight. However, he did not. There was no car, and there were no poachers. When he turned to face the clearing, all he saw in the darkness were two sets of burning red eyes staring back at him. Sergio stood there completely stunned, unsure who or what these eyes belonged to. And then, before he could do anything, the eyes began to glide closer to him. And as they did, Sergio realized with growing horror that these were not human eyes. These were not animal eyes. These eyes belonged to some creature he had never seen before in his entire life. All he could make out beyond the burning red eyes were these slim gray bodies with big heads and long skinny fingers, and they did not appear to blink at all. Sergio opened his mouth to scream, but when he did, no sound came out. And that was when Sergio realized that not only could he not scream, but he no longer was able to move. He was completely paralyzed. But then suddenly, he felt this intense pressure in his torso and his back sort of involuntarily arched in response. He tried to wrench himself free of whatever invisible force seemed to be in control of him, but he could not. It felt like his spine was going to snap. And then he felt himself begin to walk out of the forest backwards. His back was arched in this totally unnatural position, and he was marching out of the trees, completely unable to stop his own legs from moving. And then as he was doing this, he walked helplessly as one of his hands went down and pulled out his phone, and then he dialed the number of that officer. And then this detached, cold voice came out of Sergio's mouth, telling his friend to come to Las Cañas, saying that he knew what to do. And as Sergio continued to walk in this bizarre bent-over gait, he felt himself reach for his gun. And after he drew it, he watched in horror as his hands fully disassembled it and dropped the pieces on the ground, and then he watched himself do the exact same thing with his radio. And the whole time, these red-eyed creatures were just a few feet away, staring at him. It was only after Sergio had disarmed himself that he felt that intense pressure on him subside, and he realized this was his chance to escape. He took off running, but after only going a few steps, he felt himself get hit from behind, and he pitched forward. He thought he was falling, but he did not hit the ground. Instead, it was like he was being lifted up into the sky. And for a moment, he just careened through the air until abruptly, whatever force was holding him up let go. He fell to the ground and somehow managed to land on his feet, but then once again he was lifted back up, and this time he was thrown even farther through the air before he hit the ground. And then it happened again and again and again. And so as this was happening, Sergio realized these red-eyed creatures must be the ones in control, and they were playing with him. They knew he was trying to escape, but they did not stop him. They just kept picking him up and throwing him forward over and over again. And as all this happened, Sergio began to feel his feet burn. The last thing he remembered was running through a cornfield, and as he did, he realized suddenly that it seemed like he was all alone. The red-eyed creatures were gone. And so Sergio looked over his shoulder, and all he saw was swaying corn stalks in darkness, and for a moment he thought that maybe this was all over. But then, still running, he turned to look straight ahead, and he saw there was this incredible wall of just pure darkness. There was no cornfield, no ground at all. In fact, there was no sky, no moon, no stars, nothing. It was just pure black, like he had reached the actual edge of the world. And then once again, he felt himself begin to rise into the air, and he looked down into this darkness, into this void, and staring back at him were two red, glowing eyes. After that, Sergio passed out, and he had no idea how he wound up 18 hours later on the side of the road, absolutely frozen in fear. No one has ever been able to explain what happened to Sergio, including Sergio himself, but it should be noted that Argentina and South America more broadly is a very well-known hotbed of paranormal activity. Following this incident, Sergio was so traumatized that he retired from the police force. To this day, cops and locals still report seeing strange lights in and around Las Cañas. They wonder if whatever took Sergio Poeta that night is still out there waiting in the dark forest. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Short A lone cop vanished after following red taillights into a dark Argentine forest. Corporal Sergio Poeta was the victim, found 18 hours later, dry, silent, and curled beside a road 12 miles away. The strangest clue? His gun and radio were perfectly disassembled, and his footprints stretched 20 feet apart. Police suspected poachers, but there were no tire marks, no car, no struggle. Then Sergio finally spoke. He claimed red-eyed creatures froze his body, controlled his hands, and threw him through the night. He retired soon after. Locals still see strange lights near Las Cañas. What really took him? Watch the full story on our channel.